I got more, I can do this for like the whole year. And Pilate actually declared Jesus. I'm trying to walk around so the camera is actually seeing me this time. I think good views of the window last time. But when Pilate declared Jesus innocent, that should have been it. However, there was a reaction from the Jews immediately. And then we find out, this is not going to end right here, because the Jews are very upset. And here's what they say to Pilate. They say in Luke 23, but they insisted, and they're talking about Jesus, stirs up the people all over Judea by his teaching. He started in Galilee, and it's come all the way here. Now, for Pilate, this was like a firecracker going off in his head. He says to himself, wait a minute, here's the convenient solution to my problem. So I know that Jesus is innocent, and I proclaimed him innocent, but that didn't satisfy all the Jews that were there, and all of the signs that another ugly incident, and he's had plenty in his term, we've talked about them, all the signs are there. Now, you've got to remember what it would have been like for him. Jerusalem is typically a city with, back in Jesus' time, that about 80,000 people lived in. Except for the week of Passover. For the festival of Passover, that population of 80,000 would swell to more than 250,000 for that week, as everyone came to the temple to celebrate. Here you are, Pilate. You've got a cohort of soldiers with you to control everything in Jerusalem, and on the other side is 250,000 Jews. So you can imagine this crowd that's gathered outside the palace. Now, he's hearing a lot of voices back. And what he's hearing right now after he proclaims Jesus innocent is that they're not happy about it. But this might be a possible solution. And what I've kind of come to the conclusion of when it comes to Pontius Pilate is that he's a clever guy. He's a clever guy, and he has a whole bunch of fallback positions. Well, if this thing doesn't work, then I'll do this. And if this doesn't work, I'll do this. And you're going to see him backpedal into different strategies today. But in the end, none of them is going to work. But this first one came close. So he hears the Jews say, he stirs up the people all over Judea by his teaching. He started in Galilee. Wait, Galilee? That's not part of Pilate's territory. No. That territory belongs to Herod Antipas. Now, we met Herod before, right? The son of Herod the Great. And if you remember about Herod Antipas, he was what's known as a tetrarch, a ruler of a quarter. So he ruled a quarter of his father's kingdom, which was always a disappointment to him because up until just a few days before Herod the Great died, his will was that Herod Antipas inherits the entire kingdom, including the part that is now controlled by Pontius Pilate. So Pontius Pilate, Herod Antipas didn't get along. It's a convenient solution to the problem, right? If he's from Galilee, then he's Herod's problem. That didn't satisfy the crowd. The crowd's getting ugly. You know what? Let's send Jesus to the Now, for the Jews, this was good and bad news, right? Let's start with the bad news. Bad news had to be just exasperation that this wasn't dealt with right away. They had tried Jesus with the Sanhedrin. They had come to a punishment for him. They gave it to Pilate and said, here, execute this guy. And Pilate said, no, I'm not going to do that. In fact, I'm going to hold a whole trial of my own. And the outcome of the trial is that he found Jesus. So they had to be exasperated. And you can tell by this quote that saying, hey, look, he came all the way from Galilee. That wasn't what they intended. And instead of alarming Pilate about how much influence Jesus had over the region, instead they got dismissed from the Roman court. But there's good news for the Jews in here and in their aims, is that Herod Antipas is a Jew. And surely, if they took a prisoner to Herod Antipas and said, here, the Sanhedrin has declared this man guilty of death, surely Herod would say, okay, let's execute. But no, that's not how it worked out either. Now, Herod Antipas, if you remember, just last week was fighting against Pilate, right? In the whole shields up there, where Pilate had got those shields for Tiberius. And Herod Antipas had led a bunch of people, and they argued with Pilate, saying those shields break our religious laws. Pilate said, no, they don't, and I'm not taking them down. And they appealed to Tiberius, and Tiberius got angry at Pilate and told him to take them down. Well, the Sanhedrin feels like this is our God. He's going to take care of us. So how does it work out for Herod? In Luke 23, it says, when Herod saw Jesus, he was greatly pleased. Because for a long time, he had been wanting to see him. From what he had heard about him, he hoped to see him perform some miracle. And he plied him with many questions, but Jesus gave him no answer. And the chief priests and the teachers of the law were standing there, vehemently accusing him. Now, they would not have wasted time with Herod with the charges that they invented for Pilate. You remember the three charges they invented for Pilate, that he's subverting the nation, he's opposing taxes to Caesar, and that he claims to be a king. They wouldn't have bothered Herod Antipas with that. They would have cut to the main charge of blasphemy. He was convicted by the Sanhedrin of blasphemy. But what they either chose to forget or didn't remember was that Herod Antipas was about as self-centered as they come. Now, he had already put one prophet to death, John the Baptist, and his blood was on his hands. And he had taken a lot of grief from the Jews for executing John. And there was no way that he was going to kill another prophet and have his blood on his hands and have two prophets to his name. So Herod decides, you know what? I'm sending him back to the court of Pilate. He would rather have Rome take the blame for this. So in Luke 23, it says, then Herod and his soldiers ridiculed and mocked him, meaning Jesus, dressed him in an elegant robe, and sent him back to Pilate. Now, if there's one side effect to this trek over to Herod, was that there was an unintended consequence to this. And the unintended consequence is it helped reconcile Pilate and Herod Antipas. Now, why? Why would that be? Well, you have to remember, Pilate was now governing what should have been Herod Antipas' territory, so he didn't like him. Pilate would have looked down on Herod Antipas because he wasn't Roman, right? He was Jewish. So the two never saw eye to eye. They'd have been on opposite sides in the Shields affair. So by sending Jesus to his court, what Pilate was saying is, hey, I see you as a legitimate ruler. I see you as an equal. Herod Antipas took it as a compliment, because there wasn't a lot of compliments between them up till now. And what it says in Luke 23:12 is, that day Herod and Pilate became friends. Before this, they had been enemies. Now, whether this friendship survived the rest of their time in Judea, well, it's pretty doubtful. But for the moment, at least, they were on the same team. They were on the same side. Now, once again, Pilate would have been very dismayed to hear the crowd coming back to his palace with Jesus in tow. He thought he had skillfully sidestepped this problem and dumped it in Herod's lap, right? So he tries a different approach. These are one of these fallback things. Instead of talking to everyone at once, what he decides is to gather a smaller group. And he says, let's see if we can bring more of a low-key ending to this problem. So in Luke 23, it tells us, Pilate called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people, and he said to them, look, you brought me this man as one who is inciting people to rebellion. I have examined him in your presence, and I found no basis for your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. So as you can see, he has done nothing to deserve death. Therefore, I will punish him and release him. So if you're counting along, that's twice now that Pilate has declared Jesus innocent of the crimes. But he can see that the crowd is not in a good mood, right? And if he were to completely dismiss the charges and just release Jesus, well, this could lead to a riot. And a riot with 250,000 Jews on one side and just his Jerusalem cohort on the other, it's not going to end too well for Pilate. So he has to do something about that. This is where Pilate decides to administer what's known as a flogging. I'm sorry you're eating dinner during this part of the conversation. Rome had three different types of punishment when it came to offenders of the law. And there were three different types of Roman floggings, right? The first is known as the fustigatio. The fustigatio is also called beaten with rods. And it is just what it sounds like, right? They take rods, and they beat you. Now that sounds bad, but that's actually the lightest of them. The next one, the one in the middle, is what's known as a flagellatio. That is a flogging. Now, at this point, John says that Jesus was flogged, but I'm going to be honest with you, it was probably the fustigatio and not the more severe one, because after you get the more severe one, you're usually not able to stand and talk and have conversations as we're about to see Jesus. Now, why? Why would Pilate do this? Well, it's a shrewd play on human nature. It's a very... And what he was trying to do is, and they would see that the ruling of the Sanhedrin, which had declared Jesus guilty, wasn't just dismissed by Pilate. The ruling was honored through physical beating. But Pilate would avoid assigning Jesus to death. Now there's one more of these floggings, and that's called the verberatio. That is a scourging. Now, Jesus was scourged at the hands of the Romans. So that's where they actually, I'm so sorry if you're still eating dinner, but that's where they tie you to a post and they actually whip you until your body starts going into shock. And it's actually quite often weak. A lot of people die just from the scourging itself. So Pilate has flogged, and then he tries to present him after being beaten to the crowd. In John 19, he says, once more, Pilate came out and said to the Jews, look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him. That's number 3 times he's declared him innocent. When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, here is the man. And as soon as the chief priests and the officials saw him, they shouted, crucify, crucify. Now, you can tell that this response from the crowd it frustrates Pilate. You can tell because he kind of shoots back right at them because he knew that these 3 charges against Jesus were nothing but lies. And he had even administered the fustigatio, and they still wanted the death sentence. So Pilate digs in his heels and he shoots right back at the Jews in John 19. But Pilate answered them, you take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him. It's number 4, the 4th time he declared him innocent. Now, once again, the Jews see that they're not going to get their way with Pilate. And this is every time that they clash, they've never come to a good agreement. So in their desperation, they introduced their real charge against Jesus. In John 19, it says, the Jews insisted, we have a law, and according to that law, he must die, because he claimed to be the Son of God. Well, wait a minute. This is completely different than the charges that he had before. If you remember, the other 3 charges were all political. This one isn't political. This one's religious. And Pilate's response to this new charge it's very revealing. What John tells us is that when Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid. Well, that's a curious statement. Why would a Roman prefect, with all the power of Rome behind him, be afraid about this new charge? Anybody with a shred of dignity would never want to sentence an innocent man to death, especially a brutal death like crucifixion. But it's more than that, because in every other circumstance where Pilate has had some sort of judgment when it comes to the Jewish religion, he's always been woefully inadequate. He's always made the wrong decision. And here he was now presented with a religious charge that he's not going to be able to honor. At all costs, Pilate knew he had to keep these Jews from becoming so upset that they sent yet another letter to Tiberius saying, look, he did it again. After you told him to always yield to us when it comes to our religion, we presented him with a religious charge to execute this prisoner, and he said no. Pilate knew the consequences of that letter. He was already just hanging by a thread, and Tiberius would then relieve him, invite him back to Rome, hold a short trial, and execute. John 19, 9-11. Pilate says, I got to pull back Jesus inside and ask him some more questions. So John 19 says, and he, Pilate, went back inside the palace. Where do you come from? He asked Jesus. But Jesus gave him no answer. Do you refuse to speak to me? Pilate said. Don't you realize that I have the power to either free you or to crucify you? Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of the greater sin." Now, the significance of this lesson in authority that Jesus is teaching Pilate went right over his head, right? Because if Pilate understood what Jesus was saying, he would understand that it's God who is in charge and not Pontius Pilate. But there's a little bit more to this that's pretty interesting, is that you'll notice that Jesus doesn't absolve Pilate of this sin. He says the Jews' sin is greater, but that doesn't mean that Pilate's still not going to sin when he hands Jesus over to be crucified. But either way, the choice that Pilate has here is going to be a tough one. So he tries yet another clever solution to the problem. Rather than just saying no to them, we look at Matthew, and Matthew 27 says, "Now that it was the governor's custom at the feast to release a prisoner chosen by the crowd. At that time, they had a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. So when the crowd had gathered, Pilate asked them, 'Which one do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ?' For he knew that it was out of envy that they had handed him over." Now, I'd like to note here that John, in his gospel, actually puts the choice of Barabbas versus Jesus, he puts it before Pilate's second interview. But chronologically, it actually belongs here after the second interview, where the other gospels place it. Now, that's not unusual for John. John didn't write necessarily everything in chronological order. That's why we see Jesus clearing of the temple, flipping tables and clearing it of commercialism in the second chapter of John instead of in Holy Week. So the other gospels actually place it here after the second conversation between Pilate and Jesus. But either way, the choice that Pilate gave the Jews here is geared to make them release Jesus. And if they chose to release Jesus, this ends the trial just like he wanted to. So this is a clever ploy on his part. The guy that he gives him the choice with, Barabbas, was hated by the people. He was a murderer, an insurrectionist, a terrorist, if you will. And everyone was so happy that he had been captured. Well, now they have to make a choice. Do they want this terrorist let out of prison, or Jesus, who is innocent and who is not actually hated by the people? Remember, just a Sunday ago, they were cheering him as he came into Jerusalem. So the Jews get together and they start talking about this. And while they're talking about this, a curious thing happens. In Matthew 27, it says, while Pilate was sitting on the judge's seat, his wife sent him a message. "Don't have anything to do with that innocent man, for I have suffered a great deal today in a dream because of him." Now, husbands, I'm going to talk directly to you. Wives, I'm sorry, but this isn't meant for you. I've been married for over 30 years, and I know that if I were in Pilate's place and I had spent all morning trying to free an innocent man and still have the crowd not riot and protect my life and my wife's life, and then she sends me a note saying, "Don't have anything to do with them," that would have given me the biggest eye roll. Because he had to be thinking, what do you think I've been doing all day? This is what I'm not doing. And showing just a shred of good husbandly sense, he doesn't answer Procula's note, right? All right, wives, you can come back into the conversation. Sorry you didn't hear any of that. Right? All right, so while that's all going on, Pilate thought he had the Jews backed into a corner, but even this ploy failed by Pilate. So Matthew 27 says, "Which of the two do you want me to release to you?" asked the governor. "Barabbas," they answered. And you can tell that this answer totally baffles Pilate, right? And it caused him to blurt out a question to which he got a very chilling response. He says in Mark, "What shall I do then with the one that you call the King of the Jews?" Pilate asked him. "Crucify him," they shouted. And once again, you can see Pilate's emotion come through. He's totally confused. He says, "Why? What crime has he committed?" asked Pilate. But they shouted all the louder, "Crucify him." So now this trial has come to an impasse. The Jews want Jesus dead, but Pilate is unwilling to condemn an innocent man. So this is where the Jews play their trump card. In John 19, verse 12, from then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jews kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar." Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar. Now, this verse is a little bit tricky because there is a title in Rome that is Amicus Caesarius, friend of Caesar. It's an actual title for people who get special treatment from the emperor. Now, we don't know whether or not Pilate had that title, Amicus Caesarius. And some people will say, well, maybe he did. Maybe he was closer with Tiberius than we thought. Or maybe he inherited this title when Sejanus was running the empire. But either way, we know that there was a strong relationship between Tiberius and Pilate. But what they're saying in the background to all this is the choice for you is simple. Either you condemn Jesus or another letter goes off to Tiberius, telling him that you would not yield to us in matters of our religion. And that was it. That was checkmate for Pilate. Because he knew the consequences of that letter. He knew if Tiberius got that letter from the Jews, he was done. He was then recalled to Rome and executed. So he has a feeble response. He asks them, well, what do you want me to do with this king of the Jews? And the crowd responds with one of the most hypocritical responses I've ever heard. In John 19, the crowd responds, we have no king but Caesar, the chief priest answered. Now, these are the same chief priests that railed day after day against Roman rule, but now hid behind Caesar to get their way. So once again, Pilate's been defeated by the Jews. However, he's still reluctant to take responsibility for sending what he knows is an innocent man to his execution squad. So instead, Matthew 27 says, when Pilate saw that he was getting nowhere, but instead an uproar was starting, he took water and washed his hands in front of the crowd. I am innocent of this man's blood, he said. It is your responsibility. You guys have listened to me talk for 3.5 weeks now. Let me hear yours. Do you think succeed in washing the blood of Jesus? I hear a couple of no's. Tell me why. Was he in an almost impossible situation? But could he do it? Could he take no responsibility for it whatsoever? What do you guys say? Tell me why. I know one. I'm hearing no's. I'm not hearing a single yes, but why? What do you think? I would agree. He had a chance to repair his relationship much better with Tiberius than what he did. And I got to tell you, a governor who is ruling a people that have a trump card to play on him isn't a good situation. He should have done something about this long before. I would agree with that. I would also say that Pilate actually had a chance to really show his valor here, right? He knew Jesus was innocent. Was it 4 or was it 5 times he declared to the crowd that he was innocent? He held his trial, but did he stick to his guns when it got dangerous? No, he didn't. He folded. And I wonder how many of us would have done as Pilate did and said, I bear no responsibility. This is on you. Now, the answer when Pilate washes his hand is interesting. In Matthew 27:26, all the people answered him, let his blood be on us and on our children. A lot of nonsense has been made up about people who have used it as an excuse for 2,000 years to persecute Jews because they crucified Christ. But, and by the way, there is no doubt that the Jews called this curse down on themselves, and they suffered a lot after that. Less than 40 years after Jesus was crucified, Roman soldiers would break into Rome, put the people to the sword, destroy the temple, and oh boy, it got worse after that. A few years later after that, Hadrian comes in and completely destroys Jerusalem and sends the Jews in the giant diaspora. In fact, he even renamed Jerusalem. And the Jews have never forgiven Hadrian. If you ever mention Hadrian to a Jew, they'll say, let his bones be chewed to death or something like that. It's chewed to dust. That's what it is. They did suffer a lot of hardship after the calling this curse down on themselves. However, is that how we are supposed to treat the people even after they've sinned? And the answer is no. No, we shouldn't treat them like that. Like anybody else, we should speak the truth in love to them and tell them about the wonderful news of Jesus. So you will notice that this quote is often omitted from a lot of Christian teaching just because people tend to overreact to this quote quite a bit. Now, I'm pretty sure that Pilate was very bitter about the way things had worked out, but he did do as the Jews wished. In Matthew 27, he says, Then he released Barabbas to them, but he had Jesus flogged. And I'll stop for a little bit. The flogging that Jesus would have received right here would have been the verberatio, the scourging, which is why Jesus had so much trouble carrying the cross, because the scourging was, like I said, often fatal. He had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. Now, when a prisoner is condemned to Roman execution, a list of charges against him is nailed to the cross above his head. Now, this list of charges is known as a titulus or a titulus, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And as Jesus was on his way to Golgotha, Pilate had a note commissioned with his charges written on it, and he sent it to be put on the cross. So in John 19:19, Pilate had a notice prepared and fastened to the cross, and it read, Jesus, King of the Jews. Now, notice here that Pilate doesn't really make mention of 3 of the 4 charges against Jesus. It doesn't say anything about inciting rebellion. It doesn't say anything about opposing taxes to Caesar. It also says nothing about being the Son of God, which was the religious charge. Instead, Pilate chose the words, the King of the Jews. Why did he choose those words? Well, there's probably 2 reasons for that. One, it's a convenient excuse for executing Jesus. If anyone ever came to Pilate and say, well, you declared this man innocent, why did you execute him? He could always say, well, he was presented to me as somebody who was claiming to be a king. And the Romans had only one penalty for anybody declaring themselves a king, and that was death. Right. And the other reason that Pilate would have chosen those words was as basically an insult to the Jews. He's basically saying to them, here is what a king of the Jews deserves. It's a subtle dig, and you can feel Pilate's frustration in the words that he chose. Now, the Jews, they did not like that title that was put above Jesus. And they came back to Pilate, and in John 19 it says, the chief priests of the Jews protested to Pilate, do not write the King of the Jews, but that this man claimed to be King of the Jews. And this is where you see Pilate change a little bit. Because after a whole morning of arguing with the Jews and listening to them threaten him and condemning an innocent man, he was done giving in to the Jews. Pilate answers, quote, Scription, what I have written, I have written. And he refused to make any changes to it. You can feel that coming from Pilate that, oh yeah, well, take that. If you want to send a letter to Tiberius about that, you go right ahead. Now, here is where we're going to leave Jesus for the week as he makes his trek to Golgotha. And here we leave Jesus as he stumbles with the cross and has it carried for him. Here we leave Jesus as he is crucified by the Roman execution squad, and he begs forgiveness for them. Here we leave Jesus making arrangements for his mother's well-being and fulfilling prophecy by drinking while on the cross. And here we leave him as he suffers our punishment for us. Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. And then finally, here we leave him as it is accomplished place in our salvation, and Jesus gives up his life for us. Next week, we're going to find out what happens next after Jesus dies. And we're going to go through the events of Easter morning. And I'm going to go through some of the theories that are out there about what the Jews decided to say about what happened to this miraculous resurrection. And then finally, we will carry Pilate all the way to the end of his, if you come back next week. Because that's all for this week, guys.